Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to today's I4 Energy seminar. My name is Gaiman Yi. I'm the Technical Director of the I4 Energy Center. Today's speaker is my colleague, Dr. Merwin Brown. He's the co-director of the Electric Grid Research Group at the CIEE. The Electric Grid Research Group develops and administers technology research and development for California's future electric transmission and distribution system. Dr. Brown has more than 3 decades of experience working in electric and gas utilities such as PG&E, Arizona Public Service, and at DOE National Labs such as the Pacific Northwest National Lab and the National Renewable Energy Lab. Dr. Brown holds BS and PhD degrees in nuclear engineering from Kansas State University. So let's welcome Merwin.
Okay, thank you, Gaiman.
There it is, it's on. I can hear it now, the feedback. Okay, this talk today is actually more of a history lesson than anything else. And the reason I put it together was I became frustrated by watching what was going on in the electric grid community, particularly in the United States, but to some degree around the world, in which I felt it had kind of turned into, gee whiz, this is all about like the next smartphone kind of thing and getting the next applications all together. And wouldn't it be neat if the customer could have this and that? And I kept having this deep-seated feeling intuitively that, wait a minute, it's more than that. There's more at stake to that. So I really started thinking about it fairly hard. And came up with this presentation. A lot of times I do my thinking in PowerPoint where I just start putting messages down and then reordering them so it kind of makes sense. And out of it came this presentation. So that's more or less what it's all about. And there's really 2 main messages I want to get across, and I'm going to give them to you in about the second slide. So if you've had your food and you've got those messages, you can go if you want to, or you can stay and hear the argument as to why I make these assertions in about the second or third slide. First of all, the promotion of the smart grid by promising customer-side applications and benefits. I'm going to pause in finishing that statement right now to point out that this concern I was talking about is that by focusing on promising things to the customers, in a case where the customer is already skeptical about the industry they're dealing with, the basic market they're dealing with, and this is what's caused me some concern, was what could be the possible consequences if this customer is pushed too far and we get a backlash that could stop or halt the growth and the implementation of smart grid technology in the electric grid. It sort of raises the question, so what if that happens? Well, I think if these promises, if you will, if not delivered in a timely fashion, I think they've threatened to derail the smart grid progress in trying to develop and implement it. And again, you might ask, well, so what? What's the big deal? I want to point out that I think the stakes are high. I think they're extremely high if we aren't successful in getting a smart grid rolled out. And I think the public needs to be told the whole story. And this is sort of what the rest of the presentation is going to be about, which is, 1, the smart grid is a necessity for keeping the lights on and the electricity prices in check for the 21st century. And I hope to make a case for that throughout the presentations and to give you a feel for just what is at stake, how necessary is it. And then the reasons we must have a smart grid are very complex, and they've been building for decades. So first of all, you may or may not agree with me that the customer reaction to this could be a very important factor in this whole thing, and the whole rollout and marketing strategy may be badly flawed that we're going through right now. You may or may not agree with that. The other thing, though, hopefully you might get out of that is a better understanding of what are the driving forces behind the smart grid, why it's so critical, and the fact that it goes way, way back in the history of the grid, where we get the beginnings of why we need a smart grid. This is not a late kind of thing that just happened in the last few years, the last 5 years, or even the last 10 years. It's been growing for a long, long time, over time, building momentum. And so we began our story by observing the past changes in some key factors of the transmission and distribution community. And our story that I call Yesterday will go roughly from the 1890s, when Tesla and Edison were battling out as to who would actually be the one that would define the architecture going forward, and it was Tesla and Westinghouse that won that battle, and up until about the 1960s. And to characterize the grid up through those many, many decades, there really wasn't a lot of change. It was pretty stable. It was basically, the role of T&D was as a physical link. It linked the generator, which is usually centrally located away from customers, and by the way, they weren't really customers, they were meters, to the meter under a regulatory compact. Three important things there. One, the generator. Secondly, it went to a meter, wasn't so much a customer, and it was under this regulatory compact. There was an agreement struck between society and the companies that said, this is how we're going to operate going forward. And I think most of you know what that is, so I won't go into any detail on that. The operation of this grid was largely deterministic and planned. It was relatively easy. It was with very high probability. The operators knew what was going to happen under certain circumstances, and they had plans for what they would do if things went wrong, and they could generally implement them. And the architecture was mostly radial. In other words, the lines went from the generator and branched out like branches on a tree trunk and limbs and twigs on out to the various customers. And it grew over time mostly in bulk, just more of the same, more power plants, more lines, more poles and towers, more than it did intelligence. And if you don't know what we mean by intelligence, I'll be talking about that more later on. But it really didn't gain much of intelligence over this time period. Didn't have a need for it. And the key success factor was reliability. That was the main factor that drove decisions about making investments. And so let's take a look at that. Despite the demand was growing roughly about 8% a year during this time period, the average real price of electricity actually dropped until the 1970s. And so we had a very nice case of a new business here, if you will, that almost every year their product was getting cheaper and cheaper on a unit basis. And despite the fact demand was growing at an actually fairly high rate. And the declining prices were due largely to the economies of scale in the unit size of the larger new plants that were built to meet the demand. And therefore, that was an important factor in this industry, was that the next time they built the next power plant, it was generally bigger and better than the last one. It was more efficient, and the unit cost of the electricity produced generally were coming down. This was, by the way, heaven for a regulator because, no brainer. Utility comes in and says, I want to build a new plant, I want to put it in the rate base, and by the way, I'm going to lower the rates. It was no big deal for a regulator to say, yeah, go ahead and do that. The factors involved in the investment decisions were very few, and I'm going to give you an equation. It's not a true equation, it's a metaphorical equation that sort of tells you what were the pieces of the factors that went into making a decision about making an investment in this industry. And it looks something like this, that the decision was basically a function of reliability overall. In other words, the investment, you had to make the decision that you needed the increased reliability. And I'm using that term in very broad terms, meaning you're going to have to meet new demand, growing demand, et cetera. And so therefore you're going to build to meet it rather than turn customers away. And it really had three components to it. A generator, which was utility scale, and I'm using that term right now because later on we're going to see there's other scales of generation. And transmission and distribution, again, utility assets. At this time, the utilities are the only ones who played in this game. And really, the main decision wasn't so much about those three items, because once the decision was made about what the next power plant was, it just sort of came automatically. We're going to have transmission and distribution to get the product to market, but not a lot of agony over how much you're going to invest in that, and agony in whether or not you could get it built or not. So the big decision for this 70 or some years, the big decision was choosing the next power plant. That's what utility executives worried about. That's what regulators worried about, was what's the next power plant that was going to be built. But then things started to change. There were several events and trends in the 60s and the 70s that set the stage for change that are today impacting what the grid is doing or trying to do to accommodate it. The first one I want to point out I call the Interconnection Trend. In 1962, the Eastern Interconnection was established, probably mostly at that time for some improved reliability, particularly to get power into New York, because it was tough to build power plants in New York City. So they had to start transporting power into New York. It was followed by the Northeast Blackout of 1965. Didn't take very long for that honeymoon to be over. And it was followed by the creation of the North American Electric Reliability Council. So the implications of this trend was that for the first time, an unseen local outage in another utility could cause a widespread blackout, putting your utility customers in the dark. So now it wasn't your sole ability and responsibility to get power to your customers. You were now dependent on another utility and how well they ran their system as to whether your customers would get power or not. And so therefore, the stage was set for increasing attention to operating standards for the grid, because if you're going to depend on another utility about the only way that you're really going to get them to behave properly, like any good societal construction, you got to have rules by which they live by, so you know they're going to behave appropriately, or at least have a higher degree of expectation they will behave appropriately. So the beginning of a trend here that turns out to have some fairly significant consequences down the road. The second trend, which started about the same time, I picked the time around 62, 63, at least for this sort of poster child event, and that is an environmental trend. And Rachel Carson is sort of the poster child who wrote the Silent Spring series. If you're not old enough to know about Rachel Carson, she was a woman that lived during that time, developed breast cancer, and was wanted to know why, what caused it. And she went to look for the cause in environmental factors and found a lot of things that disturbed her, and she began to raise some significant environmental factors that she thought was affecting health and not only of her, but of society and the ecology and nature in general. And by the way, she testified before Congress after she'd had surgery for breast cancer. And she died not too long after that. But she made quite a stir by testifying before Congress, and really was probably the iconic movement for bringing environmental into the equation. So now we have the implications are that environmental impact became an additional factor in selecting, deciding, permitting new infrastructure. Up till then, it really wasn't a big factor. I'm not sure it even was a factor. And generally leading to longer construction schedules. As we'll see, they get longer and longer and longer. And the external costs of environmental protection begin to be internalized into the cost of electricity. Now, I'm rushing things a bit because it didn't happen in the 60s. It took a little while for it to begin to be internalized, but it wasn't too long, because by the 70s, it began to be internalized in the cost because utilities were being forced to build things like very expensive chemical reaction plants on the back of coal plants to capture the products coming out. And that's what they were, by the way. They were experimental chemical plants. I know because I joined Arizona Public Service Company in 1971, and they were having to put on a scrubber on the back of the Four Corners power plants. And I can tell you it was a big, risky step because no one knew how to put these things on the back of a power plant. And by the way, the company was completely shocked that they had to do that. I mean, it was just unheard of. You just didn't do that. And then it was kind of all because they managed to be the subject of a photograph that was taken from space, or high up anyway, that showed a plume moving from the Four Corners out across the eastern United States. And they assumed it was from that power plant. Now, later, some people say it might have been a jet contrail, but nonetheless, it was assumed to be coming from that power plant. And so, now, continuing, and this is going to go on for a long time. There are many, many of these trends and events. The next one I call, and by the way, I've struggled with how to present these, in what order. This is the best order I could come up with. If anyone can come up with a better order that makes more logic, then let me know. But the next one I saw was the fuel price volatility trend. In 1973, the first oil embargo introduced the U.S. to its first energy crisis. At least that was a nationwide energy crisis. And the implication, and I'm sure most of you know about it, some of you lived through it. I can see how some of you didn't. Or if you did live through it, you probably didn't know what was happening at your age. The implications were after almost 40 years of essentially flat prices and no volatility, fuel prices and price volatility rapidly increased during this time period. This factor influenced the federal government to open the door to non-utility generation on alternative energy sources, and I'll be dwelling a little bit more on that later on. This then led to the alternative generation trend. I guess I didn't remember it was this soon later on. And so in 1978, the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act was passed. And it turns out it had maybe even unintentional, fairly significant consequences, again, from more of a mindset in this industry than more than a real impact. And that is the implications that force utilities to contract with non-utility generators to buy electricity at an avoided cost, which in some cases unintentionally increased the price of electricity. Two important things here. One, when this was taking place, I was in the utility industry, and the utilities industry said, it'll never work because you can't have a third party build a power plant and integrate it into the system. It won't work. You cannot make it. The utility has to buy it. The utility has to operate it, has to connect it, be in total control. Turns out, just a few years down the road from this, about a third of California's electricity was being provided by third-party generators, by the way. In some ways, if we have time, it's... Oh, yes, question? Could you explain the avoided cost? Okay, that's the next one. The other factor was that in order to figure out what these third-party generators should be paid for, because they weren't expected, or in some cases they just plain weren't competitive cost with the traditional big power plants. At least they weren't thought to be. And so in order to encourage the utilities and also to encourage people to build these things, they developed what was the avoided cost. And this varied by state. But California, again, as we'll see over and over again, California is the poster child for many of these. California assumed an oil escalation price based upon what had happened in the early 70s, which was very rapid volatility and high increase. And so as a result, they were projecting extremely high prices. If I remember right, they were projecting like $70 to $100 a barrel like in the 1980s time period. And we actually didn't reach that until this century, in the decade of the 2000 time period. And so the avoided cost was really somewhat of an artificial cost that said that, well, it did vary. In some places, the state tried to actually calculate the avoided cost. What was the real cost that was being avoided? In other cases, in California, they saw this as a chance to incentivize the building of new generation technology that couldn't compete on first-order basis. And that's what they call the avoided cost. In the case of California, as it turned out, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, it became pretty clear that California customers were paying a premium for electricity over the rest of the United States due to this avoided cost. And there was a backlash in which regulators and the utilities and customers started trying to get rid of some of these contracts and change them so that the avoided cost was avoided. But it also had another important factor, is it introduced variable generation into the electric grid. When generators, for example, in California, became reasonably obvious, and in a few other places, but mostly in California. So it, for the first time, brought in a new type of generation source that doesn't come with storage built in. All other generations come with storage built in. It's in the fuel. But in the case of wind and solar, there is no such thing. So it is a true non-storage production that you have to go with when it's available. You can't match necessarily load profiles. Okay. Another trend was that we saw in the 60-70 time frame, we saw an unprecedented increase in interest rates. And the impact on that one, I think, was the major factor, not the only one, but probably the major factor that caused a $1 billion nuclear power plant to end up costing $5 billion. This was a combination of delays from environmental restrictions or environmentalists trying to stop them, long hearing times, but also long construction times. But it was the high interest rate that turned that into real negative dollars situation, to where the cost of the power plant became extremely expensive. And this set the stage for a number of other trends and changes that take place. And so I call this the trend of increasing unit cost, and that is big power plant projects with long schedules became expensive, and the economy of scale unit lost its punch. I had a personal experience with this when I was working at the time, roughly about this time period, for Gas-Cooled Reactor Associates. We were a nonprofit who were leading the federal development for a new kind of nuclear power plant, and we were working on a 1,500 megawatt electric design because of the economy of scale. And one of my jobs was both holding an international conference and also dealing with the stakeholders, which were the utilities in this case. We had an international conference down in San Diego, and the Germans came in and said, we got this idea. We have a little test facility that's 80 megawatts thermal. We think we can sell those things to third world countries for steel manufacturing and other kinds of processes, and they're inherently safe, blah, blah, blah. So then we met with our utilities, U.S. utilities, the next week, and they said, that thing the Germans just talked about in an oh-by-the-way fashion, that's the reactor we want. We don't want that 1,500 megawatt one. And we, the experts, said, but you don't know what you're talking about. You can't afford that little plant. The economy of scale will kill you. And the utilities, I remember almost every one of them around that table came back and says, the economy of scale is dead. It doesn't work anymore. And now what we want is something we can build fast and has a small piece of change in it before we start getting power out. And I won't go on the rest of that story, but they did win. We went on to something else. Then, after 2 decades of falling prices in the early 70s, the real price of electricity sharply increased. And when you look at it on a bigger scale, it doesn't look all that big compared to what the prices were a long time ago. But the point was it reversed a trend, which was always going down, and now it started to go up. And it was a lot of these earlier factors I talked about that caused that. So we have another trend that I label the reliability versus cost trend. For the first time in decades, increased reliability came with an increase in the unit price of electricity. This may turn out to be the biggest impact trend that you can look back on. In other words, what I mean by that, it's a trend that has probably caused the most disruption from this point forward. I have one other I'm going to talk about that I think it's in the same category. But I may be wrong. There may be others that are more important. But to me, this was it. Because this changes the whole equation of making decisions. And it had its consequences. One, it caused a growing tension between reliability and unit price of electric service, led to a growing tension among ratepayers, regulators, and utilities. Customers complained about higher rates, particularly the industrial type customers who use lots of electricity. Growth in electric demand began to fall off for a number of reasons. One might be the higher unit prices, that back then and these days there was an argument. Some people said that the price of electricity was inelastic, that people would pay anything for it. Others said no, it was like any other product, it was elastic. The truth was probably in between, being totally inelastic and totally elastic. But nonetheless, the demand fell off. Regulators thought about disallowing, or did disallow, rate recovery for some large utility plant investments. Some said the regulatory compact was now broken. In other words, the fact was, here you had PG&E decide to build a nuclear power plant, and they would talk to the regulators, said, we want to build this nuclear power plant. Okay, it makes sense. All your plans look good. It was to cost $1 billion. And they came back later and said, well, it's $5 billion. And the regulator said, well, wait a minute. We didn't agree to that, you know? That was a mistake. You should have never gone off that nuclear power plant. We're going to allow it in the rate base. Well, this just sent a chill through the management, of course. A lot of CEOs were going to lose their jobs over this one. And so it was said the regulatory compact was broken, so no longer could the utility trust the regulatory body to hold true to at least an implied agreement for years earlier when they all agreed to make the investment. And in Arizona, I was at Arizona Public Service Company at the time, the CEO went to the legislature and said, we're not building another thing unless you, the legislature, pass a law that says that you approve this investment and we will get a recovery for it. That was the sort of the attitude among the industry at this time. Academics and policymakers began to talk about a new power system model based on wholesale competition, and we'll see why in a minute. This led to what I call the underinvestment trend. Utilities became unsure and cautious about making new investments because of all these things. And so they said, well, you know, this is too risky now. I think we got to be very careful on what we make an investment on. In this case of Keith Turley, the CEO of Arizona Public Service Company, telling the legislature, we're not going to do it unless you make the decision to do it. This caused an investment in new transmission went into a steady decline for 25 years. And this has had consequences. One of them, transmission capacity growth rate fell behind the rate of growth in demand. And the result was the trend I call the congestion trend, in which daily transmission constraints increased electricity costs and the risk of blackouts. Because there was now enough transport capacity to get the power from the generator to every customer the way we were used to getting it whenever they wanted it at the lowest possible cost. Remember this trend I talked about in 1962, the trend of interconnection. That trend continued. I think it switched from being driven by reliability to cost. For example, in California, where prices were quite high for electricity, we said, well, wait a minute, if we can get in the summertime power from up in this area where it's hydro, it's a lot cheaper, we can keep the cost down here in California. So we started building transmission lines that connected all of these regions quite closely. And they end up being some of the largest man-made or human-made machines in the world. And so they became increasingly dependent on large interconnections to improve reliability and lower costs, but it came at a price. Remember the New York blackout, 1965, I think it was. Underinvestment reduced the operating margins. In other words, we were shipping power across now these huge geographic areas, but we would run up against the limits of the transmission system to carry power, and so we ran into the constraint problems. And we were running many of these systems much of the time with no room for error. If something went wrong, it was all over. And that's what happened in 1996 in California. We're also limited to local information. The operators were limited to local information. In other words, a utility operator in San Diego couldn't see what was going on in the rest of the Western system. Grid operators had a limited wide area situational knowledge, and often too late. In 1996, an oscillation started in this. Actually, it was going back and forth this way, but it was happening in the Northwest, and the rest of this didn't see it. The oscillation went out of control and then caused a cascading set of things to go wrong and end up blacking out most of the western United States. And by the time the California utility saw it, it was too late because they only had minutes to respond by the time they saw it happening. And then, therefore, local outages could and did lead to massive widespread blackouts. Happened again in a big way in 2003 in the Northeast. And then there's been other cases of more limited ones, like the one in San Diego area last summer. Smaller, but nonetheless significant. And so this is what I call the trend of grid operator uncertainty. That is, operators didn't have adequate infrastructure. It was now underbuilt, underinvested. They didn't have the situational information required to manage it as carefully as they would like, and the controls to go with it, and then to plan with uncertainty. As a matter of fact, I remember Jim Detmers, who was the vice president until fairly recently at Cal ISO, in charge of operating most of California's grid. He used to tell me in dinner conversations that his grid operators had essentially a zero planning horizon because the models were no good anymore. They didn't work in today's world. And so they were reacting as things happen in real time. And a very stressful situation, and also has pretty bad consequences. Another trend is advances in generation technologies improve the economics for small sizes. This study that was done by Charles Bayliss showed this trend to take place, which was, you can see again, what I talked about earlier, where over the years, at least up through about 1970, 1960, each unit cost, the bigger the plant got, the cheaper the unit price became. But then that switched somewhere about that time frame, and again, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier about with the high interest rates and things like that. The economy of scale of unit size was disappearing, and we went into instead now a period of what we might call the economy of size of mass production. And largely this is epitomized by internal combustion engines and jet engines being built on assembly lines and producing electricity with smaller units at lower unit cost. This is what I call the smaller generator trend. Generator ownership was becoming feasible for smaller companies, and even the electric customers could think of terms now buying their own generation. The next trend I want to talk about is the deregulation trend. Following other countries' leads, the U.S. attempted deregulation and competitive wholesale power markets in the 1990s. In 1996, FERC Order 888 granted equal transmission access to utility and non-utility generators. This is similar in many ways to the PURPA we talked about earlier that happened in the 1970s, 1978 if I remember right. In 1998, California established a wholesale power market with a limited retail access experiment. I put that in quotes because as it happens, there were some customers in San Diego who were actually seeing retail prices. The rest of the state, the customers they saw a fixed retail price that was based upon a regulated rate. It was the utility who faced the wholesale prices. And what happened was dramatic price increases and blackouts in California in 2000, 2001 rendered deregulation attempt as an unintentionally failed grand experiment. And in this case, things got so bad that someone had to go bankrupt. In the case of where the retail price was passed on, it was the McDonald's and the dairy farmers down around San Diego. In the other cases, it was the utilities who faced bankruptcy because they couldn't pass the higher cost on to their customers. Nonetheless, this particular experiment, which wasn't intended to go this way, had good intentions, ended up probably setting back deregulation across the rest of the United States, probably by at least a decade, if not decades. Wholesale markets continued in many places. They didn't stop. We now have them in many places. But the enthusiasm for totally competitive electric markets has waned considerably. And I would say the only place now where it's pretty active is Ohio. It's about the only place where they're really trying to make widespread retail access that I know about. And so I make an assertion at this point. I think without participation at the retail level, competitive electric markets' effectiveness is limited. I don't think we can continue forever with just a wholesale market. Right now, things are going okay because we've got a pretty good, stable supply and demand situation. But if we get out of balance like we did in California, again, I think we're going to see this fall apart again. And I think it's like balancing a marble on a bowling ball. It isn't going to stay there for very long. This is an important assertion because it has an impact later on. The change in customer trend. It's another trend. Over this period, electric customers changed also, because they weren't sitting still. Customers became more electrified. More and more processes were moving off of oil and coal, maybe even in some cases natural gas, and more electricity was being used. the behavior of the load became less resistive, inductive, and more electronic. And what this means is that up until maybe the last couple of decades, you could characterize the load of a customer by the fact they were running motors, heating hot water systems with electric coils, and they had incandescent light bulbs. And so the load was resistive, inductive. But with more and more computers coming in, electronic ballast coming in, and so on and so forth, the load was becoming more electronic. And more recently, and this is a bit of a stretch, I admit, because it's still early and we haven't certainly reached the tipping point, they are beginning to buy electric vehicles, again, particularly in California, and they're beginning to buy their own generators, a lot of them in the terms of photovoltaics on rooftops. Out of all this is the consequence is that load modeling has become less accurate and load behavior more uncertain to the grid operator. So another uncertainty that hasn't been there for decades has now come forward, in which now the grid operator has another uncertainty to deal with. His load now is hard to predict. And it turns out it's very important because they have to model the load in order to set up the grid to be able to run to meet the demand. And if the customer doesn't behave the way the load model says they do, then the system's going to be set up wrong. And I won't have time to go into it, but we've already had one example with modern high residential air conditioners creating a major voltage problem, control problem. Here's the other second trend that I think is going to have probably, potential anyway, the biggest impact, I don't know, on par with this change from reliability being the only success factor to reliability versus unit cost factor. And that's the renewable trend. We, the usual public, are going to be and are seeing more of this, more wind farms, more geothermal, more biomass, and more solar. Again, particularly in California, but throughout the world, we're seeing more and more of this kind of generation. And the majority of it is projected to be variable wind and solar resources. Now, to the grid owners and operators, though, renewable generation looks more like this. Because of the variability, it strikes fear in the hearts of these people about how they can keep the grid running under this variable condition. To better understand this trend, and by the way, if you've been in earlier talks I've given in this forum, I have a longer talk on this. I go into more detail. So this is a very high-level summary. To better understand this trend of perspective, let's explore what I call the saga of renewable generation and grid integration. Remember, for the first time now, we have a power plant that doesn't have built-in storage. You don't have a coal plant sitting by. You don't have a gas pipeline hooked up to it. You don't have nuclear fuel rods stuck in a nuclear power plant, and you don't have a big lake behind your turbines. You're now at the mercy of whenever the sun shines and when the wind blows, and that is a first in the last 100 years, roughly. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we want to build this wind power plant. And being a good business person, we're going to put it where the wind blows the most so we get the most revenues out of our asset. So we're going to go out where the wind blows. If it's a solar plant, we're going to put it where the sun shines the most. Well, it turns out most of these sites are located a long ways from the cities. People tend not to want to live in these kinds of environments anyway. And so right away, and it's also not near the existing transmission system. So I built my power plant. Now I got to figure out how to get my power to market. So I go to the local whoever, utility that owns it, the closest system, and say, I want to extend the transmission line out. Well, because of the fact that most central stations are located remote from customers, it turns out that getting access is a major issue for them. And it turns out building new transmission lines in the modern times is increasingly difficult and taking longer and longer. As I said earlier, remember I talked about the easy equation. Transmission distribution was a no-brainer. You just built them, and you didn't worry about the cost or the siting. That's changed tremendously. And now it takes years and years and years. Right now, the last I've heard from people in the industry, if you want to build a long interstate transmission system, you're probably talking 15 years now to get permission to build it. Shorter ones, like the ones to build it out to a local power plant, it may take you a few years to get permission. but that's still pretty long. But let's say that we solve that problem. We get it built. And so we hook our power plant up, and now look at that. We got a clear shot to our customers. And we can breathe a sigh of relief, and we can let those windmills turn now, and we can generate electricity. So we start generating and say, well, wait a minute, there's something wrong. The grid is reacting funny to your generation. And what it is that some renewables exhibit unique behaviors for which the grid was not designed and the operator is ill-equipped to handle. It's a lot of this variability I was talking about. This is a list of some of them, and this is a whole presentation unto itself. There are some unique behaviors, such as the volatility and unpredictability of the sun and the wind. Fast ramp rates, this is kind of a complex subject, but if you don't know what that means, it just simply means that renewable power plants, for the most part, can come on and shut off extremely fast compared to the more traditional coal plants and gas turbines, etc. This causes problems because of their fast operation for the grid to be able to maintain stability and other quality. There's also an oversupply problem. That in some ways is our own fault, meaning the way things evolved in regulation and markets and stuff, but it is a real problem. Cal ISO already has reached cases on a windy night in the springtime when loads are low where they have to pay someone to take electricity from them because it's over-generating more than customers can use. And then low inertia, which is somewhat related to fast ramp rates, but it has to do with the fact that a lot of these power plants, the renewable plants, again, they respond very rapidly, and the grid was designed for machines with big rotating machinery that respond relatively slowly. Inherently, low inertia is not necessarily a bad thing, but if the grid's not designed for it, it is a bad thing, potentially. And so that's another concern. But somehow we've got to fix these things so that the grid can accommodate them in some way or another. So let's say we fix those problems. And now our power plant owner of our wind farm says, now look, I got a straight shot to the market. You can handle my variability now and things are great. So we fire up our wind farms and say, well, wait a minute, we got a problem. The existing system is constrained. Remember, back starting in the 1970s, we started to underinvest in the transmission system. There's not enough capacity. I might add, I'm talking about renewables. It wouldn't really matter whether that was a nuclear plant, a coal plant, or a natural gas plant, or what. It's going to run into that problem. But if you want to reach a renewable portfolio goal, you're going to have to solve the problem, or you're not going to reach it. And so the problem is the existing system is constrained. Here are some of the reasons. One, I've already talked about difficulty in building new or upgrading transmission. If you think it's tough to build a new transmission line somewhere out, so to speak, in the desert, try to build a new line to the LA basin or up the peninsula towards San Francisco. That's going to be much, much tougher to get the permission to build those things. There are thermal limits. I don't have time to go into why these are limits such as they are and why I put them up here, because some engineers will tell you, well, why are you putting that up there? You have to live with them. I don't think that's true. Not with new technology, and I'm building a case for smart grid, by the way. And the same thing true of stability constraints. Remember I talked about the fact that you had these big outages, 1996, 2003. Stability played a big role in causing those things, and they have caused a lot of the transmission capacity in the West particularly to be underrated significantly. And so we've got capacity going to waste that we can't use because of these instability problems. If we could solve those problems, we'd free up a significant amount of capacity. Similarly with N-1 contingencies, another prudent operating thing just like thermal limits, but again, it puts, because of that operation, we're putting capacity to waste. If you got 3 lines coming down from Oregon down into California, you have to essentially have one line not operating because you've got to have a backup if one of those lines goes out. So you got one line not really being usable. Well, that's an oversimplification, but that's an N-1 contingency. And again, some engineers will say, well, so what? That's the way we operate. My argument is that there are new technologies coming about, and there are pressures from society and from markets to begin to think about relaxing that constraint and increasing capacity. So we increase our capacity. So now our renewable generator breathes a sigh of relief and says, now I got a clear shot to market. And guess what? There's still another potential barrier. This time, we got to go down to the other end where the distribution system is. So we're going to go down there, and we're going to look back up towards this wind farm. And so here we are down at the distribution level, looking back up. And what do we see? We see more variable generation down here on the distribution side. We got some reasonably large power plants out by the substation. We've got photovoltaics on the housetop roofs there. And oh, by the way, we got a customer plugging in an electric vehicle. Oh, okay, I got to get going. So variable renewable generation must also be accommodated in the distribution grid in the new form of distributed generation and with new loads. We somehow must accommodate distributed generation. I'm going to try to briefly explain why this just one problem that takes place. Here I have a case of a house with photovoltaics on it. At the moment, a cloud is covering it. And I'm looking at the voltage profile from the substation out to where the house is. The utility has to keep the voltage within certain limits. They're not allowed to go outside those because it can affect customers' stuff and all of this, damage it, et cetera, along this line. And so, but what happens now is this customer comes home and plugs in an electric car and causes the voltage to sag. Now it's in violation. So the utility has a few options to fix it, and the one option they're going to do is they're going to change where it taps into the transformer and increase the voltage back here, because we can at this case without exceeding the voltage. So we change the tap setting, and now we're okay. But well, wait a minute, now the cloud goes out of the way and the photovoltaic system comes on, and now all of a sudden we're in violation of the voltage because we got voltage out here from this generator, and now we're in violation. So now that the utility has to lower the tap change again to get back in. All sorts of combinations and permutations here are leading to all kinds of controls and things like this. And today's systems are electromechanical that were only meant to operate at most a few hours a day, and some of them only operated seasonally, are now maybe operating every few minutes or so. And those probably won't be able to take that. We're going to have a new approach to this. So for most of the 20th century, I've already explained this. This was what it looked like. I don't have time. But the behavior was predictable. Operators largely deterministic, and the operator was in control. But the 21st century grid operator faces this: a growing tension between reliability and cost, old infrastructure strained to the limits, new infrastructure increasingly difficult to site and build, inadequate situation of visibility for grid operators, the threats of extremely expensive, disruptive wide area blackouts and increased enforcement of operation standards, accommodating the uncertainty of markets in planning and operation and the growing change in electric customer base, complying with economic and public policy pressures like renewable portfolio standards, especially concerning environmental impacts regulations, increased use of renewable generation, and protecting grid security in a new world that we live in, and customer privacy. So as a result, in a growing uncertainty, complexity, inadequacy, conflict, and the need for flexibility, robustness, real-time situation, awareness, probabilistic forecasting, and rapid response is now the world in which the operator lives in. And so let's take a look at our new equation. Now, not only is the decision a factor of reliability, it's also a trade-off with price increase. But now look at the options. We now have generators at the utility level, the non-utility generator, and imported power on this wide area grid. Customer generation and renewable generation has to be decided on. Transmission, there's utility-owned, merchant-owned, there's the interconnection on the wide area system, and there's dynamic control questions that affect the ability of having capacity. Similarly with distribution, utility, dynamic control, and a thing called microgrid, a new concept, more or less. And then there's now efficiency. At the customer, at the grid level, and in generation, there's an option. And then storage, utility scale and distributed storage. And then finally, demand response. So now the decision-making factors is not just one big decision, it's a whole bunch of decisions, and it's going to require an unprecedented amount of intelligence to do that. I think because of time, Okay, quickly. There's a traditional build solution is one solution we have. We just build more of the same, or we get improved T&D functionality by making operations easier and costly. This one over here, the traditional build, the success factor is social acceptance. Will they allow you to build anymore? Or will the investors allow you to do it? Over here, it's mostly, can we get the new technologies developed and used? And perhaps we can build our way out of these things now, but eventually the traditional way won't work. We're going to have new technologies, particularly those that make the grid smarter. And that's sort of the summary here. We don't have time for this, but this is roughly what a smart grid is. It's a marriage of the more traditional infrastructure with an intelligent infrastructure. And then this was all the various technologies, if we'd have time, that we could look at that are available. Potentially. Bottom line, my assertion is a smart grid is a necessity, not an option for the 21st century. But not all customers are convinced of that it's in their best interest. And I'm concerned that there are two options for getting customer consent. We're going to have it one way or another. There's the carrot or the stick. The stick is the form of law and regulation, but it's probably not the preferred way, where we just tell the customer, we're going to control electricity, when you can use it, how much you can use it, etc. The carrot is probably, in the form of customer benefits, is probably preferable, where the customer does make a choice. But the carrot can't easily be delivered soon, in my opinion. But if it can't be, that's my opinion, but if it can't be, don't lead the customer on with overstated promises. Honesty is probably the best policy, so tell it like it is. My concern is, I'm going to put the blame partly on the Silicon Valleys and the Microsofts and the Googles, who, when they heard about the smart grid, said, oh, it's the internet. And it's all about selling iPhones and application-like gadgets. And they rushed in about 5 years ago and made a lot of hype about what the customer is going to be able to do. And it hasn't materialized yet. I may be pleasantly or unpleasantly, I guess pleasantly surprised that it may come sooner, but I don't think so. I think just regulation alone to be able to handle customer involvement in the markets and being part of the power delivery system, decision-making process is probably quite a few years off. Ultimately, it is a good idea. Ultimately, it's the way we need to go. What I'm worried about is that the customer may think that today I put the smart meter on your side of your house, tomorrow I get to start doing all these neat things, and it just isn't happening, and I don't think it's going to happen for quite a few more years. And I'm concerned we're going to get backlash, and we are already getting backlash. And so, the smart grid, it's not an option. It's a necessity. It's necessary, if not sufficient. In other words, there's other things we have to do. Investment for keeping the lights on and electricity prices in check for the 21st century. And the public, I think, needs to know and understand this. This also applies, people tend to overestimate what can be accomplished in the short run, but underestimate what can be accomplished in the long run. So if I were to translate that into the smart grid, we're overselling the smart grid right now, but actually the long-term benefits probably stagger the imagination of the average person on the street out there. So the promise is great. I think we just got to manage the expectations, or we're going to have a backlash like we have for deregulation in California and around if we aren't careful. So with that, thank you.
Let's open the floor for questions. Oh, wow, okay.
Hi, thanks for speaking. Actually, it's really informative. You talked about the lead-up time for building capacity being upwards of a decade or so, just due to the permitting. What are some of the barriers constraining that process? Like, how can we, or how do you see cutting down that lead-up time?
I think there's kind of two factors involved. One of them is environmental, and the other one is about, frankly, cost and benefits. The environmental one is mostly, I think, about visualization. There are real environmental impacts when you go and put a line out there in the desert. It does have an impact. It's maybe not a big footprint, but it's there. It's mostly people don't want to look at them. So And the other one has to do with cost. In other words, they cost. And matter of fact, they're getting more expensive. A few years ago, the rule of thumb was $1 million a mile for a decent-sized transmission line. Most recently, I looked at some of the projections for future projects. They're running now $4 million a mile. The Sunrise project came in at about $12 million a mile. So the costs are escalating according to what little data there is. And the question is, who's going to pay for it? And then you get into some of the other costs, which are the non-economic, such as having a transmission line running through your backyard. And if you don't get any benefit out of it, why do you want to allow it? And this is particularly true if you're shipping power from Montana to California. What's Utah and Nevada going to say about it? What do I get out of this? So why would I allow you to build something that I don't see any value to, and it has a negative consequence to it? So this is an oversimplification, but short of martial law, where the government comes in and says for national security and economic stability reasons, we're going to build this infrastructure whether you like it or not, which in the United States usually doesn't work very well. Matter of fact, in most countries it doesn't work very well. You have the monkey wrench gang out there messing things up, if any of you have ever read that book. I call it's putting transmission in a better light, and there's two ways of looking at it. The one of them is just get it out of the light. In other words, can we go underground? Can we make them more compact and smaller? Can we not even have to build them through, say, distributed generation or demand response or energy efficiency? There are those approaches. The other approach was, can we put it in a better light from a cost-benefit value trade-off? In other words, we, CIEE, led an effort to look at the cost allocation question. And what came out of that study, and was led by Joe Edo here up at the lab, Lawrence Berkeley lab, one of the things they came up with was if you look at old projects, the strategic value of the project was worth much, much more than the original project value. But yet the line was determined by its project value. If you were to bring in the strategic value, which obviously is not that easy to determine in advance, but still, if you looked at it, you might bring an extra value to it that society would then say, well, then now I'm willing to put up with some of this. Now, how do you satisfy the person that you build it through their backyard and they don't get anything out of it? Maybe it's compensation. For example, there's a merchant generating plant, American Transmission, up in the Great Lakes area that have been very successful at building transmission. And what they do is they go to each person along the way and they meet with them and say, what can we do for you to make this better? Do you want us to plant tall trees so it hides a view? We'll plant tall trees. We'll do something. They at least address their concern. Whether they could totally satisfy them is obviously within limits of economics and nature. But nonetheless, it seems to pay off. At least they cared enough to go talk to the individual and say, what can we do to make this better, rather than fighting it out in the courts and in the public hearings. So is there an easy answer? No, I don't think there is. And that's why I make the statement, we can't build our way out of this. That's one of the reasons. I don't think we can continue to cite. My rule of thumb is for every transmission line that gets cited, it's going to make that much harder for the next one because you just took up one site that you managed to get cited, and there's going to be fewer sites in the future. I think that leads to this other approach, which is the smarter approach, using technology. But you still can't get away from building.
Okay, we have another question.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. What's the current situation of the power of the smart grid construction in the United States? What do you think is the goal for the smart grid, and what are milestones? For example, maybe in the future, each home has a smart meter which can achieve a two-way communication. Do you think that's a very critical way to achieve that goal?
Okay. First of all, I really can't answer your question totally. I don't know what the ultimate smart grid is going to look like. There may not be any such thing as an ultimate smart grid. It will always continue to evolve over time. It will be something that satisfies. Remember that one slide where I listed all those things that the grid has to be? It has to be robust and flexible, et cetera, et cetera. it has to meet those rather vague objectives. You also ask about a specific question about the smart meter, and I think that's an interesting one. On the one hand, for example, when I was at Pacific Gas and Electric Company, I was in charge of R&D, and we had a visiting professor from, I forgot where, from back east somewhere, but he had written the book on transmission, and it was Dr. Granger? John Granger. And we had brought him out to help work on distribution, because even back then in the late 1980s, early 90s at PG&E, we saw distribution as playing a bigger and bigger role, much before other utilities saw it. So we brought him out to help us. And I remember he said this: without a smart customer, you can't have a smart utility. So you're going to have the smart meter. What bothers me is, though, the order in which we're doing it and the way we're selling it. Putting a smart meter in alone will not solve the problem. You've got to have it smart all the way back up to the generator, the central generator, and everything in between, or it isn't really going to work well. It's only half there. It's like having your spinal column broken, you know. If the brain can't connect the legs won't work. And so we got to think it in a more holistic sense. And I think there are some very quick economic returns for certain smart grid applications we could use now, such as synchrophaser measurement systems. Probably make more sense to rush than maybe the smart grid. I was sometimes advise investors, and I was at a forum where there were a bunch of us on a podium, on a panel, who were supposed to say, what's our one message about the smart grid? And everyone down the way was going about how great this meter was, how great the meter was. And if out of no other reason I didn't want to have to say what they were all saying, I had to think of something different. I said, actually, the smart meter is probably going to go the way the PC did, the personal computer, which was, we saw a time in the late 80s, probably early 90s, in which companies were buying the personal computer and they were putting them in, but they were using them as fancy word processors, and they probably weren't paying for themselves. But they were putting them in largely, I think, because of peer pressure, and you had a good salesman by the name of Bill Gates, and who was working with their computer people away who were running mainframes, and he convinced them that PCs were a good deal. And so they put them in, and they weren't economical, probably. At least there's been some studies that said they weren't. But they were there. And pretty soon, they started hooking them up through local networks. And then they started to get more applications written for them. And today, they're now, you can't run a company without one. I think the smart meter is going to be the same way. We're going to look back and say, in a couple more years, we're going to look back and say, why do we make this investment? They really aren't paying off the way they said they would. By the way, there are utilities out there and regulators who disagree with me violently, who say they're already paying for themselves. I'm not totally convinced of that. But we certainly aren't realizing their full value, let's put it that way. And it won't be for a few more years. But I predict, just like Arthur C. Clarke said, what can be accomplished with these things is, from the long run, is probably very difficult to imagine, but I think it will exceed our imagination. And we'll turn around and say, in those few years out, it was the best investment we ever made, was putting those smart meters in. Because ultimately, you've got to get the customer hooked up. And another assertion I made, we can't do it with wholesale markets alone. We've got to bring retail markets eventually into the picture so the ultimate person who flips the switch can know what the impact is on the price, assuming that we don't do this through martial law and regulation. Then you're going to have a way of communicating and having the customer interact on this thing. And I think the smart meter is probably the way to do it. So does that answer your question, I guess? It's never simple.
Hi. So I just had a question when you talk about renewables. So you were saying that renewables in general tend to have high variability and low inertia. What do you think will become more of an important aspect in terms of integrating them into the large system? Increasing the inertia of the grid itself with things like storage, or decreasing, I guess, in some ways, the inertia of the end users with things like demand response?
I really don't know. On the one hand, oversimplifying it, if you can control the customer's behavior, it's probably the cheaper way to do it. But in talking to the operators, they have a great fear of that. They don't trust human behavior. And when I was at Arizona Public Service Company, they had big peaking problems with air conditioners in the summer. And so they tried different programs. This was before this kind of thing was in vogue, because they had a very special problem in Phoenix, Arizona. And so they tried certain kinds of demand responses. And what they found out was for about 3 days it worked. But at about the 4th and 5th day of high temperatures, the customer said, forget all of this. At any price, I want cool. And so they turned them all on, and bing, the peak, right back up. Whether that will really happen or not, whether we can develop systems, markets, or regulations, or technologies. There are technologies, like at Pacific Northwest National Lab has developed a grid-friendly appliance technology that can let equipment in the house vary with probably the customer never knowing it even adapted to the situation because of the rapid frequency in which it does it. That the operators may not be able to rely on demand response, at least totally. So that puts us back onto others, such as rapid generation or the storage. Rapid generation is here, and it is available, and it's what's really right now the default. It's gas turbines, and GE and Siemens are coming out with new super generators that respond fast, can operate high efficiency at low part loads, etc. But they have their drawbacks. They require fuels, they produce pollution, and they have to be connected to the grid somewhere and sited somewhere. Storage looks really neat. It can be put distributed, it can be put central, but we're really struggling with how to get it implemented. And I happen to serve on a national committee looking at this question, and we're putting a report out right now for Congress. And frankly, we can't agree among ourselves as to how to go about doing this. And this is off the record, I guess, but within the group, there's a strong bifurcation. There are those who say it has to be through markets, it has to be through pricing. No other way can it be done. The others who says it's only by making it a utility asset can you get storage put in place. And we're total disagreement now on this committee, and it may be we will drop the whole discussion out and default punt and say we can't decide, Congress. We can't recommend a way right now. That's which is the best way to go. You have these options, but we can't agree on it. It all has to do with whose ox is being gored, frankly, and whether you trust utilities or you trust markets, et cetera. So storage has some tough road to hoe. But now, as someone pointed out, it may sneak up on us. Storage is actually being very successful at very, very distributed fashion in cameras and laptops and things like that. And someone on our committee has pointed out, we could all of a sudden wake up one day and find out those things just all of a sudden grew. And they started putting them together, and they started providing maybe a house with some storage. And one of these days, we wake up and we have storage. It just happened. I don't know whether it'll happen or not, because there's also some issues with it. So there is no best way right now. And then you ask about inertia versus variability. Right now, variability is the big question mark for most people. That may be because inertia has been largely ignored. It's only been in recent times the question has been raised. On the other hand, inertia may not be a real problem. There has been some work done. DOE's funded some work that looked at inertia from a frequency regulation point of view and found out it didn't have much impact by reducing the inertia. But these grid instability problems I'm talking about, no one has got a definitive answer on that yet. So we may find out the hard way. And one other problem that the renewables may create, at least Jim Detmers at CalISO used to speculate on this, is it used to be we added facilities fairly slowly and changed the topography slowly. So the operators kind of knew where the great white sharks were flying, swimming around out there with regard to oscillations. So they knew when to watch and how to watch and somewhat avoid them. Now we're talking about putting a lot of smaller systems that are going to be coming off and on, here and there, here and there. It's going to change the topology on a regular basis, and will change the dynamic characteristics of these oscillations and create new ones that they don't know about. Because it's all about the geography, frankly. It's all about power plants fighting one another. That's what creates some of these instabilities. And if you've got the power plants nailed down and pretty much know how and when they're going to operate, you can sort of expect when the oscillations are going to show up. They generally show up, by the way, because a disturbance happens. A customer goes offline or comes online when you didn't expect it, or a power plant shuts down when you didn't. But anyway, I think that's to be determined yet, which is going to be worse. But right now, if you ask most people, it's variability. That's the biggest problem. The next one's ramp rate, which are sort of go hand in hand.
Any more questions? I guess that's it. Thank you very much, Merwin.
All right, thank you.
We'll have to give you more time next time, a 2-hour talk.
That's my fault. I told too many war stories.